It's a lot of let's record a lecture from a famous person, let's upload it, and then we'll give you a little quiz and we'll test your knowledge. And then you got to pay for a certificate. Okay. But I think there's like deeper existential questions about the quality of the education, right? If we're so seduced by the brands, we've really missed the boat on what am I learning? And how am I growing? Who am I connecting with? That element is starting to, I think, be called into question in some really profound ways.
I'm Ranjor, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. Today I'm talking to Nick Martin. Nick is an educator, technologist, and social entrepreneur with over 15 years' experience working in social impact. He's the founder and CEO of TechChange, a Washington, D.C.-based social enterprise that builds world-class online courses and events on topics that matter for hundreds of leading social sector organizations. Nick is also a faculty member at Columbia and Georgetown Universities and sits on the board of PopTech, a global network committed to the vanguard of emerging technology, science, exploration, and creative expression. In this conversation, we discuss growing up at the intersection of politics and creativity, with a dad who was chief of staff for Ronald Reagan and a mother who was a weaver and an artist. Studying education and human rights at Costa Rica, then starting a first unsuccessful nonprofit before finally starting TechChange. We also talk about the failures of higher ed, the promise of online learning in democratizing knowledge and making it accessible, and many other topics. This conversation with Nick is one of dozens of upcoming conversations we have lined up for you with best-selling authors, designers, scientists, entrepreneurs, and thinkers who are changing our world for the better. So follow this show on your favorite podcast app if you don't want to miss these episodes. And now, let's jump right in with Nick Martin. All right, I'm sitting here with Nick Martin. Nick, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, great to be here.
So these days we do a COVID check-in before each episode. So I'd love to hear about where you are in the world. How did COVID affect you personally, and then how it affected your work?
So I live and work in Washington, D.C. and run an educational technology and online events and conferences business. So on a personal level, definitely some difficult and challenging times to get through this here in town. But on a professional level, it was actually a really exciting opportunity to provide, I think, a platform for humans to convene and connect in a strange, weird, and difficult time. And we're really excited and proud of the work we were able to do over the past 18 months to convene all kinds of incredible communities virtually who would have never otherwise had a chance to connect.
Yeah. And you kind of are in an interesting position because you're both the CEO of an online learning platform and a professor in a couple of traditional schools. And, I read some pretty frustrated tones from the disconnect. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
It's a great question, Aaron. I've been teaching at Columbia and Georgetown and George Washington Universities here in the U.S. for almost 10 years. And I love the students. I love the experience of being in the classroom. I was a high school English teacher for a couple of years at the beginning of my career. So I love many aspects of teaching, but the institutionalization of that teaching has been a huge point and source of frustration. And anybody who's ever been an adjunct can, I imagine, empathize with me and sympathize with the fact that there's very little support, there's very little structure, there's very little pay. It's just really a labor of love. And it was really clear to me as the pandemic set in just how unprepared university systems were. And it was all of them, right? It was, there were probably shades of some schools better prepared than others, but the lack of support, the lack of empathy for the students going through this, paying, in the United States at least, really expensive tuitions, So yeah, I was in a position to completely reorganize my classes based on my experience as an online facilitator. But I know that many of my colleagues weren't in that same position. And I think it was a challenge. So I'm happy to talk more about that.
You wrote that essentially the university said, "Here's your Zoom account. Good luck."
Yeah,
That's
pretty much.
quite striking. Yeah, yeah. So we like to start this conversation by learning a little bit about the person. And so I have this opening question that I usually ask, which is, what's something you learned early in life or in childhood that still drives you today, still with you today?
My mother was an entrepreneur, and both my parents had really interesting career journeys. So my father was basically executive secretary of the National Security Council in the White House and was famous for bringing the email system to the White House. And my mother was a professional weaver. She studied master weaving in France and came home and had a loom, and everything was by hand. So I had these really fast parents with very interesting careers. And my mother was a hustler. She was an entrepreneur. She was out. She would weave these gorgeous scarves and throws at home, sometimes taking as long as 10 to 12 hours per throw. And then she would, on the weekends, she'd go sell them. And for many years, I was both involved in the production of these because there's a specific part of the weaving process where you need another human to keep the tension when you're winding the warp. So little Nick was there pulling back while mom was making this beautiful throw. And then I would on the weekends go with her to go sell. And it was a really interesting experience to be thrust into a kind of sales and selling capacity.
Nice.
And then on my dad's side, just learned so much through his experience with technology and politics and Washington and the way that world works. And we had a little computer in our house that was inside a safe. And every morning, Dad would wake up and he would read all the global communiques from all the embassies across the world. And he would then take the top 5 or 6 and go in and brief the president. And those early days, we had some fascinating technology in our house. We had a red phone. It was a direct line to the president. And every once in a while, I'd pick up that red phone. And I was 4 years old. I'd say, "Hey, Dad, are you there?" And there one on the other end. "Mr. Martin, would you like to speak to the president?" I'm just looking for my dad. So I think a combination of the kind of entrepreneurial spirit that my mom taught me and the kind of technology and political savviness of my dad's journey both had a big impact on me.
Wow. And your dad worked for Ronald Reagan, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
This is a really interesting time also. If you look at kind of what you've learned, is there any particular lesson that you think you carried out of this?
They both were great about giving me the creative freedom to find and pursue a path, but also really at every turn emphasized the message that if you can work for yourself, and it's not easy, it's quite difficult to carve out that path. If you can work for yourself and create something with other humans, that is a rewarding and powerful journey. And that stuck with me, I think. I'm grateful for the freedom that they afforded me to say, we've had our journeys, but we want you to have one that's unique and authentic to you. But also, if you can, really try and work for yourself and create something that is the hardest, but often most rewarding path. And it stuck with me, I think, in many ways.
Nice. You said that, when you were trying to figure out what to do, your dad really wanted you to go into the CIA.
Yeah, there was a time when he felt quite strongly that I should carry on in some of the family footsteps. And this was kind of wild. He'd set up an interview for me at the agency. And it was right around the time of the Iraq War. And I was going to Swarthmore College. I was really not into all things CIA and Defense Department. And I really kind of put my foot down and said, I'm not going to pursue this. And it was hard for him, but I think he's been a big cheerleader ever since. And I like to tell the story that he was one of the first TechChange students when we were teaching courses online. He signed up for a bunch of them and is quite active. And I think, I think it's always hard for parents to want the best for their children, but it was really, I needed to be doing something with education. I needed to be doing something international, and full credit to the work that people do in these agencies. It's not an easy life, but it just wasn't for me.
Yeah. So it sounds like you had many interests. Tell me about all these different paths that you considered, and then what did you end up going for in college?
Yeah, so I was really into computer science, and then for my senior project in high school, designed a website, was really interested in technology early on, but the discipline that spoke the loudest to me, I think, was English literature and education, I think, in concert. but loved books, loved reading, loved being able to have a window into the human condition. And literature for me combines the philosophy, psychology, politics, religion into human stories in a way that I found just to be really incredible. And so when I was trying to make a decision, I thought what I really wanted to be is an English teacher. I did that. I went through the process, got my credentials, taught in downtown Philadelphia, high school senior English. So really valued that experience, but also felt strongly compelled to have a more international flavor aspect component to my journey. That's what took me to study education, human rights, and peace in Costa Rica.
So tell me about this. This is the University for Peace.
Oh, yeah.
Right? It sounds super interesting.
Yeah. We used to joke. Yeah. The idea of, you call it U-Peace, and it's a really magical place. It's a community of maybe 250, 300 students from all over the world, professors from every walk of life. They have one-year master's programs and PhDs, but it's situated on this beautiful campus in the natural forest Central Valley in Costa Rica. So you look out your classroom window and you see these gorgeous volcanoes. There's a little rainforest right there when you walk out the classroom door. So it was a really incredible place to wrestle with some of the challenges around how human rights, education, international law, all these things come together. And for me, having that experience as an American outside of the country was really important. I think there are many great schools in the US, some of which I teach at, and I'm very happy to be involved in. But this was just such a different and unique way to access some of these really hard and thorny problems that we're facing the world, and met just incredible humans on this journey who, to this day, I'm just so grateful I've had a chance to learn from and spend time with.
This came up recently in another conversation where there's a sense that the US is so all-consuming and so absorbed in its own news cycle.
It really is.
That when you emerge from it, it's enough just to go outside of the country and open the news, and suddenly the whole world reappears. And I know this as someone who lives both in the US and abroad, is you turn on the news. Outside of the border of the US, it's all about the whole world. But inside of the US, it's only US almost. So what is some of this opening? I would love to hear maybe one anecdote or story from, kind of the world appearing to you in a way that's refreshing or interesting.
Sure. So many. But I took an international law class my first month and a half there, and it was taught by this incredible human rights lawyer who had been a political dissident, a young professional. He's probably in his mid-30s, but he was exiled from Egypt because he was gay, and he was writing various politically charged articles, and there were death threats made, and he was tortured, and he was able to get asylum and found his way to Canada, and then found his way to Costa Rica. And so it was just this incredible human who'd had this really traumatic life journey. And he brought so much love and energy and perspective to, I was never going to be a lawyer, right? But studying international law was such an amazing experience. And he would connect the curriculum to Foucault and philosophers. And so it was just this really rich experience rooted in his own personal journey. But it was really in search of a better world, not let's hold the grudge and live in that past trauma. And that is hard to do, right? I cannot even imagine his human experience, but to live through that and then to bring that kind of positive, powerful worldview to the classroom was amazing for me. And, a very privileged American coming from Washington, D.C., who's not had that kind of life experience, was so transformative. So anyway, that's just one, but I will tell you that there were lots of incredible professors from all over the world. And to me, that's the power of education, is being able to learn from others' lived experience who can challenge and force you to rethink a lot of your assumptions and privilege.
Wow. Does this place still exist, the University for Peace?
Sure does. You can go and study any one of, I think they have 8 or 9 master's programs still. They have managed to do really well in COVID, and really can't say enough about it, especially coming from the US. It's much more affordable experience. But beyond that, I think this kind of ability to reflect on the international experience, not in America, I think I think every American should do that in some way.
So tell me how you got started with nonprofits and your journey, because you were involved even before starting TechChange, right?
Yeah. My first foray into nonprofit work was actually through University for Peace. So there was an opportunity to work with one of the professors back in the United States in a kind of fundraising, student recruitment capacity. And there was a nonprofit being set up that was called U.S. Association for the University for Peace. And if you know anything about the UN system, you know that there are a number of these, what we call kind of friends of organizations that primarily do fundraising and outreach and communications for various aspects of the UN. And as our university was this kind of quasi kind of UN agency component university, we set one up and I had the opportunity to work with some really amazing humans to do some of that fundraising. I had a board. I was raising money for scholarships. We were in the latter stages actually helping to set up programs for classrooms in Washington, D.C., elementary school classrooms in Washington, D.C. and in Costa Rica, and doing kind of exchange over the internet type experiences. That was pretty early days. That was 2007, 2008. And really enjoyed that work, but hard to sustain nonprofits. And that was a big lesson I learned early, is that it's difficult to ask people for money. I had some tremendous donors who helped to support that, but just wasn't sustainable. And some of the work we were doing around anti-bullying and conflict resolution in classrooms as part of this peer-to-peer classroom exchange, it was just ahead of its time. I think that now a lot of the anti-bullying work, even in the last couple of years, has really come to fruition. For us, it was a bit early. So also, the financial crisis didn't help, right? I think that kind of housing crisis, 2008, really just destroyed the American economy and made it difficult for people to pull out their pocketbooks and say, yeah, let's give some money to this small nonprofit.
Interesting. And so did you take any lessons from that part? Is there anything that stayed with you?
Well, I learned a ton about marketing and sales because I was actively trying to recruit students. I had to build a website all by myself. I had to develop partnerships, channel sailing partnerships for the student recruitment piece. And I think the other big lesson for me in that chapter was it's really important to have a product and a service that you can sell. Or at least for me, that was an easier value proposition. And it's difficult to get people really passionate about your cause. To this day, we work with many incredible nonprofits. They're very successful at this, but it is challenging to figure out how to appeal to companies, the foundation world, the high net worth individuals in a way that stays authentic to what you want to do and also is sustainable for the journey you're on. And so I think just a lot of lessons around the business model and what I as a human felt comfortable doing in terms of how to reach out and actually create value for audiences and partners.
Interesting. Yeah, I feel like the structure of a nonprofit has its limitations. Sometimes the structure of a business, even if your goal is social impact, is actually easier to maintain. So tell me about TechChange. So TechChange is a business, right?
Social enterprise, yeah.
Tell me how it got started, what was the goal, how it evolved over time.
Yeah, big question. But as the nonprofit was winding down and I was realizing that there wasn't a sustainability model in place, I started to get really excited about the role that technology was playing in international development and humanitarian work. It was around the time of the Haiti earthquake. If you remember, there was that terrible earthquake in Haiti in 2010. And that was really an interesting moment because there was a lot of technology being used to find victims, to triage support, to actually do the mapping of the city of Port-au-Prince, which had been completely devastated. All these volunteer people with internet connections and a little bit of training were able to come in 24 hours and remap the city by drawing lines over satellite imagery. So there were these really amazing examples starting to crop up of how technology could be used to support international development efforts. But there really wasn't a lot of skills building, capacity building, training out there. And it certainly wasn't being offered in a way that was accessible and distributed for a global audience. And so our big bet, and I say our, but I should probably back up and say I had a team. I knew how to hire interns and people because of my nonprofit experience. I didn't have any money. I had some ideas about how TechChange could be real. And I just put some feelers out, started to make some connections, met a couple of truly incredible humans in those early days. No one was paid at that point quite yet. We were just barely able to fund a small office space. But I think the financial crisis in a weird way also helped us because it meant that there weren't as many jobs currently out there. And so I was able to find a few folks who, had either lost their jobs or were trying to get back on their feet. And I had, of course, had this challenge leaving my nonprofit, which was still heavy. And we didn't have a ton of runway, but we had a little bit of money to make this work. And the big bet was that there were humans out there scattered around the world who were working in humanitarian and international development capacities who were excited and curious and wanted some aspect of skills building for their work related specifically to technology. So that those early days were all about building courses on a platform that they could take with other humans, sometimes 3-4 weeks at a time, that helped them build their network, helped to give them some skills, got them up to date so they could go back to their employer and say, I have all these ideas about how we could use mobile devices to water and sanitation outputs, or this vast world of mobile health and how to do everything from patient diagnostics to text messaging campaigns, right? For people to wash their hands. So we really tapped into something. And of course, in those early days, people were paying for the courses, but it wasn't enough of a business. It wasn't big enough. And maybe we were just so early that I think that was part of it, that we were kind of artificially constrained in terms of total addressable market. But that initial B2C model really did evolve to sort of working more directly with organizations who had an audience already sorted and who wanted to build courses and develop trainings with us. And that was kind of the second chapter of TechChange.
So it's really interesting. So looking around the system, and I'm wondering how much of this was there at the start. It's kind of an online course system with very practical skills. And the other thing that's interesting is it seems like most of these courses have multiple teachers. It's not just one person. Like most of the other platforms, it's like one teacher per course. And here you hear a variety of experts. Was that there from the start?
It's funny you say that. It really was. And I think a lot of that was a function of we didn't know. We weren't experts. And we kind of had I was teaching, right? So I decided as part of an exercise of legitimacy, I thought it would be a good idea to figure out how to become an adjunct professor. And it was also, as I mentioned earlier, something I was passionate about. So I was a professor, that was true, but these topics were so varied and rich and complicated that we really felt like we needed multiple humans to come at it from multiple vantage points. And that has been a consistent bedrock of our model for 10 to 12 years now. Wow. And even today, when we are teaching a course on gender and data in partnership with Facebook and Data Pop Alliance, every week there's a new expert. Every week there's someone else who takes it a different direction. And so that idea that the facilitator is really the thread who joins the conversations, but that every week there's a different perspective is, I think, a better way to learn. I mean, it does take more work to thread those conversations, but it decentralizes the sage on the stage model in a way that I think is really critical.
Yeah, I think maybe because it's for a good cause, it's easier to get more teachers and more into a single course. Whereas if this was a big for-profit and you had to consider how it affects the bottom line, it would be harder. But it's a really interesting, exciting model because almost every course already comes with a built-in community of experts that are already contributing, and then the students come in. So tell me about the reactions. It seems like a real energy behind it from the start.
I think we were surprised, again, a small group of unpaid nerds in an attic. We were a bit surprised by how quickly the demand for what we were doing took off. And again, this was before Coursera, before the MOOC revolution. This was very early days of online learning. The biggest thing we had out there were these, MIT had a bunch of free resources, but a lot of it, and even to this day, this is still true, but a lot of it was self-paced. And so to do a live cohort-based course online was different, was unique. And I think that was something people were hungry for. Imagine you're a humanitarian worker working in Sudan and you have, your internet's not great. It's okay. But you're not necessarily connected to a community of professionals who can push your work farther. And so, we did find a lot of really powerful case studies and examples of being able to connect dots in humans who weren't able to come back and get a master's degree from Columbia, SIPA, or Georgetown, right? It's not possible or not easy to do a lot of that. And then I think a lot of what we really are very proud of is that a lot of local leaders, people who are in these communities who really never would have an opportunity to travel outside their countries to go and study for costs and geography, were able to access something. And I think that access and inclusion piece, I don't think we appreciated how important that was going to be. And that is amplified in the pandemic. It's manifest in the virtual conferences and events that we run and these large scale free open trainings, the hunger and desire for professional development and to really grasp any opportunity that's out there that can distinguish you from the marketplace is tremendous. And again, I don't think we fully realized or appreciated that when we started, but it's definitely been clear to us as we've evolved.
Yeah. So it seems like it's a very specific niche. It's for a very specific group of people trying to upskill and catch up and stay involved. Oftentimes they're in remote places. They're making a real difference. Actually, every time you upskill them, that can make a massive difference in reality, in the results. And nobody was catering to them, partly because I'm guessing it's not as profitable as doing like courses for the broader population. And so, yeah, I'd love to hear like some stories that really touched you or some examples of how this made a difference in people's life.
We were very involved early days in what we call global digital organizing. And we taught one of the first online courses in Sudan in 2011 or 2012. So just a fascinating experience. And one of the women who was part of the Sudanese diaspora, was living in Geneva, was actually like helping us facilitate this course. And we realized a week into the course that we had half Arabic speakers and half English speakers. So we were scrambling to kind of connect the dots and to sort of reorganize an experience to cater to these two language audiences. But there were some really interesting and powerful outcomes out of that course. Again, this was the first online learning experience for most of these humans. They were members of the diaspora also involved. We were very careful to not be too political in the orientation of the content. But at the same time, anytime we talk about organizing, it does get very political. And so, yeah, there were some incredible kind of local activists and humans part of that journey that took some of the things they learned. And every course has a final project, and they got feedback from some of the experts and were able to implement small projects related to digital organizing in their communities, which I thought was really incredible. Fast forward, 10 years, here we are. I mentioned earlier, but I'll mention again, this idea of combining gender and data and trying to build a community around it has also been a big part of our journey over the past 2 years. Ironically, Facebook, who is not necessarily well loved by the nonprofit and international development communities, has a phenomenal team working inside of it that is charged with trying to connect the dots with Facebook programming and the Sustainable Development Goals. And so they did a big landscape analysis and said, what's not being funded or what's not being supported is work helping nonprofits, particularly those that are working on gender, build their data science capacities. And so came to us, we built a really exciting curriculum. We were all set before the pandemic to teach this in person in 6 different cities. And the whole world changed. And they said, well, what are we going to do? And I said, well, we happen to be an online learning studio first, right? This is our primary orientation. So we were able to reposition the content, redo the curriculum, and pretty quickly get up and running with a cohort-based course. And we started with, I think, 500 people in that course. But the demand, Aaron, was incredible, right? We had tapped into something. There were humans all over the world who were passionate about gender, but felt like the data science world didn't speak to them, or the data science world looked a certain way, was exclusive in certain ways, was too expensive. And here we were offering this free, very rich course, rich in the sense of like activities and experience and support. And so we did this cool thing. We basically had the cohort, but then we, 10 months later, did an alumni showcase. And we had the top students or the most involved students from that first 500 cohort come back. And they were now the ones running the workshops, doing the case studies. We had recorded a bunch of different sessions with them about how they had taken their newfound data science skills and applied them in their organization. And to me, that's really the heart of the TechChange model. How does the student become the teacher? How do we empower folks? Because again, these are all professionals. They're perfectly capable of teaching and learning. How do we empower more people to experience that circle, right? Go from student to teacher, and then give back to their communities, whether it's inside their organizations or to a broader group. And so we see ourselves as the platform for that. We see ourselves helping to facilitate that. And some of the stuff that came out of this, the different case studies and projects, really just tremendous. And so I am every day inspired by what our team at TechChange is able to pull together, but also the humans that join us on these journeys and help co-create these pathways. It's incredible.
You're listening to Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. If you're listening on a podcast app, you already know how to follow podcasts. So please follow this one. If you're listening in a browser, just go to remakepod.org to find links to all the major podcast players where you can follow our show.
Yeah. So this comes in the context of a world that, the kind of general educational establishment and also the world of nonprofits to some extent can be pretty dysfunctional in many ways. And you went as far as to say you really have an issue with, you use stronger words about higher education. So I want to quote from an article you wrote. You said, in tech, we've seen students do an online course for $10,000 on how to code and then be able to qualify for a job that pays $90,000. But when students shell out $200,000 for a humanities degree, that equation doesn't work out the same way. Universities, and this is really hard to hear, but true, universities are not putting all that wealth towards admitting more students, making education more affordable, IT infrastructure, or even back into their staff and teacher training. Where is that money going? And why are we continuing to accept the status quo as the only path forward? So tell me, what's the deal with higher education? I mean, I think this is especially in America, but what's going on here?
Get me all fired up. Listen, I think there are so many root causes to this. And, we could spend all day on this one question. I think to me, it really can be distilled down to a general sense that we've lost our way. These big brand universities have really gotten lost in the money. And here in town at GW, it's a real estate enterprise, right? There are just more and more buildings being built and acquired. And in other contexts, I think we saw with the Varsity Blues scandal here in the United States, this just obsessed clientele, parents who are so desperate to get their kids into the best school. And the kids, by virtue, feel this like real sense of weight that they are not worth it if they don't get in. And I think we really have a lot of work to do as a culture to challenge some of these traditional paths and challenge some of these journeys. I think a lot of it has to do with the people in power who are in the hiring manager positions. They want to see their own journeys reflected in the people they hire, but are closed to the reality that that journey is a lot more expensive, is a lot more exclusive than it was when they went through it. And again, I don't think that the schools have a whole lot of incentive to change. I think there's just very little keeping them accountable. And it's tragic in a way. I think right now, I was talking to some of my younger staff and colleagues who are just out of college, and they've graduated with humanities degrees and they're having hard times getting jobs. And so the first instinct is, well, I should go back to grad school. And it terrifies me because I think that's a lot of money. You really have to know what it is you're going to do. And nobody tells these kids, nobody says to them, hey, let's have a hard look at the math. All right, if you take out a loan for $200,000 and your entry-level job out of that master's program is $60,000, and you don't, because we've seen all this fiasco with the federal loan repayment assistance programs, and you don't get that loan covered through other sources, that's a 10, maybe 15-year journey that you're on to carry that debt. And that's going to mean things. That's going to mean you don't have the career that you want to have. That's going to mean that you are making sacrifices on the personal front to sustain that. But the schools, they don't tell you this, right? They just say, hey, we'll give you 20% off, a scholarship. And then the real problem is that the community, us, we are all guilty of this. We are so indulgent in the impressiveness of these brands. And so if somebody who's really floundering and doesn't know what to do and can't get a job says, oh, well, the best thing I can do is go get a degree from Georgetown, because then my parents will get off my back, my family and friends will be impressed, and I will keep my career. And look, there are many people who will be listening to this and say, yeah, but my Georgetown or my Columbia degree made a difference. And even my students were like, Nick, I met you, and then I hired one of my students last year. Like, it's true. Your grad degree can lead to great things, and it should. I think really to me, it's about not having enough discipline in the decision-making process to think about those trade-offs in ways that are really important to a long-tail journey. And that's really like, if you read my LinkedIn, that's a lot of what I'm trying to help position folks for is like, what does the long journey look like? Your career is decades. How are you every day making decisions that appreciate the twists and turns of that long journey? And grad school to me is this one that's, really got to be sure.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, the remarkable thing is the debt issue is not a problem in the rest of the world. You don't have to take on like a 10-year loan. I'm involved with a lot of system thinkers, and a lot of the conversation we have are like, we talked to David Peter Straw, who wrote Systems Thinking for Social Change. And, they're talking about the system is perfectly designed to achieve the results it's achieving now. Right.
Yeah.
That's the concept of equilibrium. And so when you have a system that's just extracting the life out of young people, and this gets them into a huge amount of debt, and then in the law, they can't actually go bankrupt like any other kind of debtor can say, I need like a blank slate. Just these young people can't do that. You have to ask yourself to some extent, was this system designed to achieve, not necessarily maliciously by someone who like intended to do this, but it's serving so many other players that it's just not motivated to change at all, including the political class, right?
100%. No, listen, I thought when I started TechChange that I could cut into this market share, that I could say, hey, friends, look at how you're getting robbed by this whole system and how unfair. Man, was I wrong. Man, did I miscalculate that question. And, looking back, I now don't even try to work with higher ed. I think I'm impressed by the startups that have cracked that. It's been a real challenge for us. I will say this, I love teaching and I love the students, and the individual administrators I've met have all been fantastic. It's really an institutional problem.
Yeah.
But you're right, there isn't much pressure on the system to do something different or to change.
So, one thing that I observe, because I'm in Israel most of the time these days, and so what I see there is almost the other side of this. There's respect for brands. So we understand that there's certain institutions that have become brands, and that's almost impossible to unlock. But then there's constant creation of new brands. And so a new university, small college comes up, but then they get a few world famous scientists. They do a whole branding campaign, and suddenly that's a really cool place to go, even though it didn't exist a few years ago. And it's changing the dynamics. And it's also, there's competition on price. And so I wonder if that's part of the deal, is like, you can't challenge Harvard by saying brands are not important. The only way to challenge Harvard is to create a better, more modern, more effective brand, right?
Yeah, I don't know that you can create a better brand than Harvard, but I think you can create alternative brands that solve different problems that have a better value proposition for the students who might enroll. And I think you're right. That is, I would say that's interesting to hear that's happening in Israel. I think there are many pockets where that's happening in the United States. I think the pandemic, in many ways, one of the silver linings is that it has proven some utility and value for online learning and distance learning that maybe some were more skeptical about prior to this time. So I think that's exciting. I mean, yeah, you can go tomorrow and get a $5,000 alt MBA degree. That's not a degree, but it's an experience, and like learn and have a very practical, curated, community-focused journey, and not pay $200,000 for an MBA.
Yeah, this is Seth Godin program. I've done your podcasting program. It's amazing. Yeah.
It's great. It's great. And I think there's just, there's dozens of great examples of this type of innovation happening. And, my wife did that program. Like, she loved it. I think there are going to be more and more examples of this cropping up. But I think the kind of Coursera model where like, let's partner with the brands to do something different, it's kind of worked, but I think there are still a lot of skeptics. The way that those courses are designed aren't really great. It's a lot of let's record a lecture from a famous person, let's upload it, and then we'll give you a little quiz and we'll test your knowledge, and then you got to pay for a certificate. Okay. But I think there's like deeper existential questions about the quality of the education, right? If we're so seduced by the brands, we've really missed the boat on what am I learning? How am I growing? Who am I connecting with? That element is... it's starting to, I think, be called into question in some really profound ways.
You wrote that instead of using this time of COVID to innovate, redesign the modern day classroom, or simply invest in better technology or training for professors, universities focused on how quickly they'd be able to bring students back to campus. And I sort of sympathize. So what we do in my business is to do design workshops, product design workshops. And we, before COVID, used to always fly around the world to do these workshops with the clients. And we charge a premium for that. And then suddenly you couldn't do that anymore. And so there's this panic of like, are they going to not be willing to pay the same amount? But we found that if we focused on the quality of the output, that didn't matter so much. If we said, okay, let's create the best online version of this, Yeah. So is there hope for the traditional universities? Are some of them doing anything worthwhile, interesting, or do you think they'll just eventually be, replaced by more agile startups?
I think the top universities are going to be just fine. Nothing's going to change. They're going to coast. They're going to learn all the wrong lessons. They're going to continue to do what they do. And even in those universities, there are professors and there are administrators who are doing incredible work. So it's not like a wholesale rejection. But I think institutionally, their incentive structures are just not aligned to kind of challenge the status quo or produce quality in person versus quality online education, right? If I had that kind of brand power, yeah, I would lead into it too, I guess. But I think the tier 2 universities and below are really going to have to think about the ways that they evolve and create value for their students. And some of them are, looking internationally, right? There's still value in an American education for international students. I have questions about that, but that is still, many communities still see that value. And so like where you go in America doesn't matter as much as like going to America to study. And so, yeah, some universities are leaning into those international markets. Others are getting serious about online. And I think you could look at Arizona State as an example. You could look at Western Governors, Southern New Hampshire. There's some really incredible universities that have said, even George Mason here locally, have said, look, we are all in. We're going to make the investments in our teams and our facilitators and our teachers and really try and lean in. And then there are others that sort of partner with the 2Us of the world and they build these master's programs and there's sort of qualities all over the map. But there's legislation that was changed so that now startups can actually work with universities and do all the marketing, do all the student recruitment, work with the professors to build the courses and take a large chunk of the cash home, right? 70, 80% of the revenue and still have the federal grants and subsidies paying for that. I think that's a really slippery slope. Personally, I think that once we get into the game where these startups with other incentive structures are coming in to help universities who are already not aligned, and together they're just making tons of money off of federal. To me, there's like alarm bells, right? And again, I think there are pockets of great examples of programs and people doing good work, but the system is highly questionable. So
yeah. So it's leveraged from probably both sides, probably the government on one side, or probably VCs on the other side, and then you have to justify that. And I wonder who pays for it at the end. So yeah, I'd love to get a little bit into your head in terms of how to do this right. So what does great education look like with all the new technologies correctly implemented to actually create value for students?
I think there are a lot of ways to answer that. I can tell you where we've landed in our 12-year journey, which I think will be somewhat illuminating and get at the heart of your question. For us, great virtual learning is we call blended or hybrid, where we have largely synchronous or blended courses of cohorts of people, right? Humans that are learning together at the same time. And those humans, we believe, can be anywhere as long as the internet connection is good enough. We have not leaned into the mobile education revolution as much as others. We really feel like it's a little challenging to have a full immersive learning experience on a mobile device. Now, I think you could challenge that. I think that there are some really exciting examples of that happening. For us, it's just having to make tough decisions around where we focus our attentions. And it's still that kind of browser-based learning experience where we really feel the most value. However, we are reaching into all kinds of communities where there isn't traditional forms of internet or access. And so we're excited about that reach with online. And we think that does make for great learning when you have a diversity of humans from all kinds of backgrounds coming together. A world where relationships are as important than skills. I think this has been like totally lost over the past 10, 12 years of online learning, which is all like skills. You need to skill up and we'll certify and credential you and micro learning and okay, fine. All those things are still useful and valid, but how to also make space for learning, which we know is an inherently social activity, how to make the connections meaningful online is like an existential question that every day we grapple with. How do we build the right technology, tools, and features and build the right facilitation techniques, put them together and create those kind of meaningful connections that are And I think the other piece that we're seeing, what makes for good learning, is like a practical application and relevance to people's lives. I think every TechChange experience has a final project associated with it, right? What are you going to do to connect the learning that you've had in this journey with your world? And hosting a dinner party and talking about the things that you learned, hosting a session for your staff, your fellow staff, either virtual or online, about your outputs, having some kind of project component where you're building a roadmap to execute on a vision. I think that's big. And again, I think the last thing I'll say is like, now that we're doing virtual events and virtual conferences, we're really trying to abstract one level up to say training and courses and learning should also be a key element of how we convene in general, right? I think that like conferences are learning experiences for us, and we're trying to take what we've learned from the education and training side of the house and really say, all right, now we've got some high production plenaries, we've got some really engaging networking experiences, but ultimately this is just a different kind of learning journey.
Yeah.
And a lot of the same rules still apply for what makes it great. And I think that's really where we've seen a lot of reception and uptake in the past 2 years, is people scrambling to figure out how they're going to do their virtual conference and coming to us and needing a solution. And we are able, I think, to create a kind of high impact and really valuable, intentional experience for their communities.
This is something that's not at all easy to do. And on the one hand, amazing developments during the COVID period. Some of the conferences that I would kind of be like, yeah, maybe 1 year I'll go to. You're now like, you could go to all of them from your home. And some of them are so well designed that you really feel like you're there with a group of people. You really feel like you have networking opportunities. But at the same time, it could also feel exhausting, disappointing. So what did you find is the essence of, really feeling like your presence with a group of people and you're really engaged?
Again, I think it gets back to like what excites people and why do they go to conferences? Most of them go to meet other people, right? And so if you can create an experience technologically where they can have, our metric is 5, they can have 5 meaningful connections at a virtual event. And maybe those are people they do business with. Maybe those are people they just, are more curious to follow up with. That's pretty powerful. So working backwards from that goal, how do you stage creative interactions and activities that get to that magic number? And for us, we have 3D worlds that have been, I would say, mostly hit, but it's still a new technology that I think people are struggling to get. We've built stunning venues all in the virtual world that people can move around in. It's been pretty neat. We've used some really cool technology to do kind of small table work and small group discussions of about 5 to 7 facilitated. We've had various kinds of matchmaking and networking kind of techniques that we've used. And then a lot of like really cool team building activities. We've used Miro. We've used a lot of these other tools that I'm sure you have as well. But really well-designed activities that allow people to blow past the fatigue to like connect, right? That's a lot of this. But I 100% agree that there is something, it's a different kind of fatigue, right? I think we're in the point right now in this pandemic journey where everyone is tired of online. But I think once everybody goes to their first conference and gets on a 14-hour flight, gets sick and gets food poisoning, comes back, okay, I've done that. Now maybe I will do the next couple virtual. I think we're going to find a balance that honors this sort of somewhat cyclical nature of how we as humans manifest our needs to connect.
Yeah. And I think that probably there'll be some, I'm just thinking about myself, I would be willing to replace any conference with virtual except for the top 1% most meaningful ones where I want to know these people in person. So actually most professional conferences, no problem, but there's a few that are so essential.
That's how I feel. I'm on the board of a group called PopTech, which is an interaction design and technology conference that usually takes place up in Maine, about 250 people. And it is just such a magical experience. And I brought a group of about 20 of my friends in 2019. And yeah, I think that would still be, there are elements of that would be hard to recreate. But again, I think we are moving towards a world where we can do both. We can go to those handful of conferences that really make a difference in our journeys and have an experience online that is also meaningful and engaging. And the last thing I'll say is for us, it's really been fascinating because a lot of the people that have joined these conferences, digital health, any kind of international development, agriculture, innovation, would never be able to go on a plane to go to a conference, right? It would just, I think this idea of access and inclusion, we underestimate how important this is for a global discourse. And I think it's kind of shocked our community a bit. I think in global development, we are on paper really big about inclusion, but in practice, we have expensive conferences usually in the United States that only 5% of people from the global south can come to. I don't think that's going to cut it anymore. I think we are in a world order now where you can't just talk the talk. You've got to really walk the walk. And our partners are leaning into that. They're saying, you're right. We've got to really think about inclusion in a new way. And I think that's a great output, right? I think that's a great direction that we're headed coming out of this pandemic.
Yeah, I definitely have a strong sense of that from just moving our events online. And before it was only like we did it in the US or in London or in Israel, and then the local people would show up. And now it's like in a single event, you can get people from the US and India and China. And suddenly you're like, oh, wow, completely different. And it also definitely feels like people are more grateful when it's actually you've made an effort to make it accessible. So in your experience, you've done quite a bit of work with NGOs and, you're actually serving people who work out in the field for global NGOs. There's a lot of dysfunction there too. And I guess one of the gaps you're filling is actually a gap of the structure itself that doesn't invest enough in training. So tell me how you see that world and how it could be better.
Yeah, it's a great insight that we would probably be less needed if nonprofits really did invest internally into capacity building. But it's also a challenge. I think it is a challenge for them to do that well. And having had these partnerships with a number of really fantastic NGOs for many years, understand that carrying an internal learning and training and development team working on projects can be quite expensive and challenging. And I think learning and training is always kind of this, where do we put it, right? Is it part of the projects we implement in countries? Is it part of HR and operations? To what end are we professionally developing our staff? Who gets these opportunities? If it's the end users and the people in these countries, how are we measuring our success? I think there's just a lot of really interesting challenges that these groups are up against. And almost every international development project has some kind of capacity building element to it. And so it's as if everybody appreciates this is a critical thing, but there seems to be a lot of challenge internally about how to center and really make that element have quality and be meaningful. And I think a lot of that gets into like how murky it is to measure people's educational outputs, right? I think that we have some projects where we're training people how to administer antiviral courses for malaria, right? So like there can measure how successful pharmacists are. And in this case, we were working in Uganda, Nigeria, in terms of administering that based on the curriculum that they've taken, right? There's some courses we have around vaccinations and you can measure, how successful these campaigns are. So I think there are some areas where straighter lines between educational experience and good real world outputs. But a lot of it is less so, right? We're doing a digital health leadership course, working with ministries of health around the world right now. And it's challenging. Yes, we can look at how policy is changing. We can look at tool uptake. We can look at, there's data out there. It's just difficult to always connect those dots. So I think nonprofits are still struggling with that. And then that relates to how they staff, how they hire, and how they build these. But again, I do think that there is a growing appetite and excitement for virtual in ways that we've never seen in 10 years. And that's really what we're trying to lean into. I think there's a kind of a fine line or a spectrum of, all right, we need to professionally develop our staff, but we also need to just collaborate better virtually. And a lot of these partners that we've got are also coming to us to help facilitate workshops and strategy and planning around how remote work for international development, humanitarian, nonprofit has changed culture so much. How do we now get the most out of our people, out of our ability to operate and to implement projects? And that's been another dimension of our work, has been trying to support them in those journeys. So I think there's a lot of change afoot. I think most of it's good and excited to see where it lands.
So there's this phrase, measure what matters. It's kind of the hint that, whatever you measure, you're going to do more of. And I've heard opinions that with the nonprofit sector, there's too much of an emphasis on what percentage of the funds go directly towards the projects. And that kind of makes it harder to invest in growth and effectivity in hiring the best people for the job, which can make a big difference. So what's your opinion on that kind of KPIs?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, on the one hand, you want to make people, entities feel good about their contributions, and you want to have a narrative that says a large percentage, close to 100 as possible, goes to help the person in need. And so I think there is a real tangible pressure to approximate that all nonprofits feel. But I think you're right in saying that if they don't invest in the operational sort of general long-term needs of the organization that enables that delivery, then it's all for naught, right? We can't build better institutions if we're not. So a lot of this just gets into some of the real challenges around philanthropy and how donors think about their money and how kind of capitalism relates to philanthropy. Right now, the billionaire class is giving away a lot of money and also has really strong feelings about how that money is being spent. And nonprofits are having to wrestle with some really challenging existential questions around how did the billionaire make their money? What harm did they do, in leading up to that? And is taking that money going to offset? Are we going to be greenwashing this? Like if we take money from an oil company to go plant trees, and so I think there's some really interesting questions being asked around that. And again, I think they do have challenging, nuanced, complicated answers. And we've watched a lot of nonprofits struggle with this because this is their lifeblood, getting money. And where that money comes from is really challenging. So I asked a good friend who's leads a very large international NGO over the weekend, what's worse? Is it taking money from Congress or taking money from a government or taking money from a high net worth individual? And he said, hands down, a high net worth individual is the most challenging to deal with. And I think I thought that was pretty interesting insight. Someone who's been doing this for 50 years.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on the person. Someone like the Bill Gates Foundation, they're challenging in the sense that they need a lot of measurement of impact and results. But I feel like it's probably less about photo ops, right? Or spending or greenwashing.
It's such a good example, though, because you could make that case about Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but at the same time, the brand is still at the mercy of these two humans. And now they're divorced, and now Bill's got some bad press coming out. And so if you're a NGO or a program officer at that foundation, you kind of are having to navigate this, like the public identities of these humans that are at the top.
Yeah.
And I think you could rightly ask some questions with any of these billionaires, like how did they make their money and what bridges did they burn and harm did they do on that path? So I don't know. I think they're easy answers, but I think good questions to be asking.
Yeah, that's a complicating factor I haven't considered. But I think it also would be probably acceptable for someone to say, what we're doing is good. We're not endorsing anyone by taking their money. We're just turning that money to a good cause. And I don't take responsibility.
A lot of them are doing that. And I would say a lot of staff are raising questions. I think these are good dialogues by and large. It's hard to turn down money, but I have seen organizations do that too. And it can cut both ways, I think.
Yeah. So I want to close this conversation with our kind of traditional closing question. So in his TED Talk, the philosopher Alain de Botton talks about the difference between a lecture and a sermon. A lecture kind of being the modern, secular, dry and factual, like I'm just going to give you a little bit of information and you make up your mind. And a sermon being a more urgent plea that's trying to change someone's life. And so I want to give you a little stage for a short sermon for young people, young learners who want to learn and want to get into this world and do good. What is one lesson that you would want them to have that could really change their life and their journey for the better?
Maybe I'll start by saying I would use the opportunity for a sermon to enter into a conversation, right? And I think for me, I have many things I've learned in my journey, and I recognize enormous privilege along the way to be able to do the things I did, and also a lot of luck, which we don't talk enough about in our journeys. I do spend a lot of time on LinkedIn talking about making sure that people are connected to some sense of fulfillment or passion in their work. I do believe that, at least for me, having that connection and having that passion in my work has made for a more fulfilling life. I fully recognize there are people who work to live. I just think we spend a lot of time working. We should, in theory, really be excited about what we wake up and do every day. And I guess I would say that there are just so many opportunities to live meaningful, purpose-filled lives in the social impact space. It doesn't have to just be a nonprofit. Now there are many companies that have social impact outfits and opportunities to work for them. There are many foundations. And so I am really on a mission in my public-facing role on LinkedIn is to sort of educate folks about the possibilities, right? You can still choose to work to live, but at least know that there are many interesting jobs out there that might fulfill you in ways you hadn't considered, and that might still pay the bills, and that might still kind of satisfy the basic human needs that we all are up against. But I also think to get to those journeys, you have to really be considerate about the degrees and the money you're spending that might inevitably force different trade-offs after the fact. And that, I think, relates directly to what we already spoke about with the educational choices that you make. And I just think there's so many ways now to skill up, to take advantage of low-cost, high-quality training, especially if you're interested in technology, and then apply those to social challenges and social sector needs. And so there's so much out there. I would say follow me and I will do my best to curate the right kinds of resources and opportunities for you on this journey. But I think that if it is something that people feel strongly about, having a career of purpose, there are so many ways to manifest that now than there weren't maybe 20, 30 years ago, and do the work to make sure that you have really the full spectrum of opportunities. And the last thing I'll say is I think the pandemic has also crystallized this for a lot of folks. I think there's a forcing mechanism here, which has said, hey, look, life is kind of short. Life is tragic. Life is hard. I think ultimately either people want to work less, which I think is a great output, and I want to honor that. Spend more time with family, spend more time with the ones you love, rethink your location and where you are trying to live and do your work. But also, if you do want to have a career of purpose, that there are so many ways to shift gears and to really lean into that. And I think a lot of people are taking that challenge and taking that bet and trying something new. So it's not to say that institutions on the kind of do good work are perfect. They are certainly not. They are dysfunctional, as you said, but I think that is also an opportunity to come in and build better, right? I think the problems the world's facing, they're not going away. They're getting worse. So we kind of have to figure out how we're going to solve them, and we need the smartest and most agile minds on these challenges. Otherwise, we're in real trouble. So anyway, I'll stop there and just a vote of confidence for a career of purpose and an invitation to be in conversation with any of you who are listening. If you follow me on LinkedIn, feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Nick.
All right, that's it for today. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to support it, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast app or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We run design sprints all over the world, and our goal is to improve outcomes, whether in business or various organizations, through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone. See you next week on Remake.